The rise of leper colonies in 11th century Europe. In the shadow of castle walls and cathedral spires, leprosy emerged in 11th century Europe as an invisible siege. Pilgrims traveling to Santiago de Compostela, merchants plying the Rhone and Danube, crusaders returning from Jerusalem all carried whispered tales of ghastly flesh and numbing pain. Fear grew with every new arrival of the afflicted, whose patches of white scales and open sores defied medical knowledge. Without an effective remedy or understanding of contagion, communities turned to isolation. Local councils, bishops, and monarchs wrestled with moral and practical dilemmas: how to care for the suffering while protecting the healthy. Out of that crucible arose the first leper colonies, small hamlets of exclusion and compassion carved into the hinterlands. The earliest lazar houses were established in the Ile-de-France around 1020, often under monastic auspices. Church councils declared lepers legally dead, stripping them of property rights, civic status, and even the right to be mourned in death. Canon law placed them alongside excommunicates suspended from sacraments until formal readmission, if it ever came. Local lords, tormented by both fear and charity, carved parcels of common land beyond city ramparts. Simple wooden palisades or low stone walls enclosed clusters of cottages. These boundaries served as both barrier and sanctuary. Inside, the rejected found rudimentary shelter. Outside, townsfolk felt safer under the vigilant watch of gatekeepers and clergy. Daily life in a leprosarium was governed by strict ritual. Residents donned coarse, patched robes, capuches and sackcloth dyed in muted ochres, and wore lead crosses or badges to signal their condition. Each person carried a staff fitted with a small bell or wooden clapper. Its tolling warned passers-by to avert their gaze and step aside. Mealtimes followed the ringing of a larger bell, drawing lepers from their huts into a courtyard where bowls of coarse bread and barley pottage awaited. Donations of salted fish or cured pork arrived sporadically through narrow slots in the wall, while wooden spoons and forks prevented direct contact between giver and receiver. Medical care remained primitive yet heartfelt. Monastic infirmarians applied poultices of marigold, comfrey, and rosemary to raw lesions and used honey dressings to stave off infection. Bloodletting and mercury treatments circulated among more adventurous healers, often exacerbating misery. The air inside chapels was heavy with incense, believed to purify both flesh and spirit. Daily Mass and rosary recitations offered a framework of hope. Relics of saints such as Lazarus or Giles were enshrined in ornate containers, and pilgrims left coins and tokens for the salvation of suffering souls. In these enclosed sanctuaries, physical decay coexisted with fervent spirituality. Knightly orders augmented monastic care with martial zeal and organizational skill. The Order of St. Lazarus, emerging in the Crusader states before spreading to Europe, rigged their white mantles with distinctive green crosses. Brothers guarded hospital precincts, escorted processions of lepers to Mass, and enforced strict discipline. Their service blurred the lines between soldier and caregiver. They embodied both chivalric honor and Christ-like compassion. Similar orders, like the Hospitallers, integrated leprosaria into sprawling networks of care, balancing the demands of warfare and charity on distant frontiers and at home. As the 12th and 13th centuries advanced, leper hospitals proliferated across England, France, Flanders, and the German principalities. Charters endowed them with mills, vineyards, and pasture rights, creating modest but sustained incomes. In Brittany, some institutions managed entire parishes, employing secular guardians to handle estates and ensuring that families of the afflicted were not left destitute. Legal codices refined the terms of alms, daily bread, weekly ale, annual stipends for clothing and bedding. Yet these economic entanglements also tied leprosaria to the vicissitudes of politics, making them vulnerable to war, taxation, and shifting priorities of noble patrons. The arrival of the Black Death in 1347 shifted European attitudes toward contagion. Quarantine measures, 40 days aboard anchored ships, strict cordons around infected towns, proved chillingly effective against both plague and leprosy. As sanitary science slowly gained ground and diets improved, the prevalence of leprosy waned. By the late 15th century, many lazar houses had been converted into general hospitals or repurposed for other charities. Some fell into ruin, their walls reclaimed by fields and forests, while others were absorbed into burgeoning urban infirmaries. Today, the silent ruins of medieval leper colonies linger on remote hills and beside forgotten roadways. Archaeologists uncover pilgrim badges, tally sticks recording alms, and skeletal remains bearing telltale signs of Hansen's disease. Weathered carvings on chapel doorways still depict Christ touching a leper's hand, a potent reminder of the tension between fear and mercy that defined the era. These relics ask modern observers to reflect on how societies confront the unknown and the suffering they cannot cure. As your narration guides viewers through this hidden chapter of medieval history, let them hear the toll of the leper bells, sense the echoing stone corridors at dawn, and imagine the fragile hope offered by a shared prayer. In the rise and fall of these colonies, we find a profound paradox. In their isolation, lepers became both outcasts and beacons of compassion, forcing medieval Europe to redefine community, charity, and the meaning of mercy itself. The leper bell, forced to announce their presence. In the dawn light of medieval Europe, the leper's bell tolls like a mournful warning, slicing through the stillness of village lanes and crowded marketplaces. Each measured ring, a haunting summons, reverberates across the cobblestones, a declaration of suffering and exile. For men and women marked by the White Plague, the clanging brass bell was both a lifeline and a burden, an auditory barrier between the diseased and the healthy, a relentless reminder of society's fear. Lepers inhabited a world apart. By the 11th century, leprosy, an incurable ailment then known as the Great Pox, had spread like wildfire along trade routes and pilgrim paths. Its ravages, numbness, skin lesions, nerve damage, provoked dread and misunderstanding. Faced with this invisible terror, medieval communities erected leprosaria on the outskirts of towns and cities, walled enclaves where the afflicted could be tended but never touched. To ensure that the uninfected kept their distance, the church and secular authorities imposed a stark ritual: the bell. We must imagine the scene, a solitary figure rounding the corner, draped in coarse robes, carrying a stave. At their waist hung the leper bell, its clapper held loosely in hand or left to rattle against the frame with each step. Ring, ring, an audible cloak of isolation. Passers-by scurried aside, children froze in place, market sellers lowered their eyes. The bell proclaimed, make way, a leper approaches." It was a mandated etiquette, a ritual of shunning etched into law and custom. Historical texts confirm this practice. In 1021, the Decretum of Burchard of Worms explicitly instructed that the afflicted wear bells or clappers to signal their presence to the pious faithful. By the 12th century, the Third Lateran Council under Pope Alexander III reiterated these rules. Lepers must dwell outside urban confines, must wear distinctive clothing, and ring bells to warn of their approach. Breaking this edict was not a mere social indiscretion. It constituted a crime against communal order, punishable by fines, and in some regions, corporal chastisement. The bell served multiple purposes. Practically, it alerted those who might cross paths in narrow streets, preventing inadvertent contact. It warned domestic animals like horses and dogs, which might sniff at the sick. Yet the symbolic weight of the ring fell heaviest on lepers themselves. Each toll echoed their segregation, a soundtracked condemnation of their bodies. They became living liturgies of pain, parading their curse before the world. Monastic communities, often the custodians of leprosaria, recorded the names of bells: Misericordia, Pena, Faithful Witness, and consecrated them in ceremony. A bell's chime was said to carry prayers of mercy from within the walls, appealing to God's compassion on both the afflicted and the fearful. Still, the clang remained a barrier, reinforcing the binary of pure and impure. The pilgrim roads to Santiago de Compostela were dotted with lepers, their bells tolling at dawn. Pilgrims offered alms from a safe distance, slipping coins into wooden alms boxes. These donations sustained leper hospitals and cloisters, but maintained the gulf between the healthy seekers of holiness and the suffering souls at the edge of the road. In some regions, superstition held that a bell's toll had the power to ward off the devil, but others whispered that its ominous ring summoned darker forces. Art and literature echoed this duality. Illuminated manuscripts depict lepers with bells at their waists, halos of stigma framing their haggard faces. Chaucer's pardoner cynically ridicules the fearsome reputation of leprosy, while medieval poems portray lepers as wandering prophets, their shame a conduit to spiritual truth. In regions like Normandy and England, local ordinances, such as those recorded in the Statute of 1427 at Angers, mandated that lepers ring bells and wear yellow crosses on their cloaks. Skilled bell founders cast these grim tokens in bronze, inscribing verses like Miserere mei, have mercy on me, around the rim. Within the damp stones of leprosaria chapels, the bells tolled at canonical hours, marking time for prayer while reinforcing the grim separation between community and exile. As the centuries wore on, leprosy receded in Europe, vanishing by the 17th century, thanks to changing climates, isolation practices, and burgeoning medical insight. The bells fell silent. Some melted down to forged church bells, their metal repurposed for worship within familiar walls. Yet the echo of those bell tolls lingered in collective memory, a testament to humanity's struggle with disease and difference. Today, scholars sift through hospital ledgers, canonical decrees, and parish chronicles to piece together the leper's world. The bells, at once protective and punitive, reveal a society grappling with contagion, compassion, and control. In their sonorous warnings, we hear fear and faith intertwined, a discordant melody that shaped medieval life. As we reflect on that era, the leper's bell invites us to consider our own boundaries, how we respond to illness, how we balance empathy with caution. The bell tolls still in our conscience, challenging us to remember the echoes of history, to ensure that in the face of suffering, our empathy rings louder than our fear. Lepers were declared dead in legal and religious terms. Imagine a town square in medieval Europe, hushed under a pale dawn light. A small crowd gathers, anxious eyes fixed on a lone figure draped in tattered gray robes. This person, once a fellow neighbor, now bears the mark of leprosy. Their skin, scarred and mottled, tells a story of suffering and fear. Today, the church bells do not ring in celebration, but toll solemnly, announcing a different kind of rite. In many regions, from the rolling hills of 12th century France to the bustling merchant cities of Italy, lepers were treated not merely as patients, but as the legally dead. Through public ceremonies, they were stripped of all civil and religious rights. Their names were expunged from parish registers, their property seized or redistributed. This ritualized death served a dual purpose: to protect society from contagion and to satisfy the Church's need to categorize and control the afflicted soul. The ceremony often began at the edge of the community. The leper, led by a priest and accompanied by 2 deacons, would stand before a crudely carved cross. The priest might chant a solemn prayer, invoking the sanctity of life even as he declared the leper dead to the world. A funeral shroud would be placed over their shoulders, symbolizing the final severance of former ties. Onlookers, instructed to avert their gaze, bowed their heads in silence. The leper's house was then ceremonially closed and sealed, a physical boundary marking their separation from life within the walls. Under canon law, this declaration had profound consequences. Lepers were denied entry into churches, forbidden to receive sacraments. They could not invoke the protection of feudal lords, nor could they own property, marry, or engage in trade. The symbolic death rendered them outcasts beyond the bounds of human and divine law. In the eyes of both state and church, they lived in a liminal space, neither fully alive nor truly dead, inhabiting a shadow world where mercy and condemnation intertwined. Yet, beneath the legal formalities lay a deeper theological struggle. The Church grappled with the tension between Christ's healing miracles and the reality of mortal, incurable disease. Lepers were often associated with the biblical affliction of divine punishment. Some theologians argued that they bore the mark of sin, while others invoked the compassion of Christ, reminding believers of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Still, the ritual of declaring them dead persisted, an uneasy compromise between doctrinal rigidity and the call to mercy. Records from medieval Toulouse describe one ceremony in vivid detail. A group of lepers gathered in front of the cathedral, each carrying a wooden stake. A priest recited verses from the Liturgy of the Dead. At his final words, each stake was driven into the ground before them, a symbolic marker of their new status. Their homes were then redrawn on church maps with a black cross, a warning, and a memorial. Outside the city walls, a small colony received them, a place where they might live apart, receive alms, and attend Mass from beyond the ramparts. In Castile, the crown issued edicts that confirmed these practices. Letters from King Alfonso declare that lepers shall stand as if in a grave, forbidden to leave their isolation unless clad in specific garb and ringing handbells. These legal documents reveal the thorough integration of religious ritual and secular law. The boundaries between sin, sickness, and social order blurred, creating an institutionalized system of exclusion. Despite the harshness of these rites, some lepers found solidarity in religious orders. The Order of St. Lazarus welcomed the afflicted into their care, offering a form of sanctuary. Within leprosaria, walls provided safety from violence, but also walls of separation from loved ones. Caring monks recorded names in worn ledgers, offering prayers and hope for salvation beyond earthly life. When the bells finally fell silent, a haunting stillness enveloped the square. The handbell's echo faded, leaving only the distant cry of a child and the rustle of the wind through empty streets. The leper, swathed in linen that felt both protective and suffocating, stepped away from the altar of final judgment. Each footstep carried the weight of lost identity, each breath a reminder of exile ordained by law and Scripture. Some chroniclers wrote of lepers who, in their exile, carved inscriptions on stone walls, prayers for the living left behind. They pleaded for a world that feared to face them alive. In convents and monasteries, secret vigils were held where nuns and monks prayed in the dead night hours for deliverance from this human-made curse. These whispered devotions remind us that compassion endured in the margins of ritualized cruelty, that even the declared dead could reach for hope. Reflecting on these ceremonies today, we must ask how fear shapes law, how ritual can dehumanize, and how remembrance can restore what was once declared irretrievably lost. Leper priests and monks who volunteered to live among the outcast. In the waning light of a medieval dusk, a solitary bell tolls across the silent courtyard of a leprosarium. Each measured chime carries a weight of sorrow and compassion, the signal that another soul, afflicted with the grim specter of leprosy, approaches. Yet, amid the echoes of fear and rejection, there stir figures draped in humble robes. Priests and monks, their hands stained by ointments, their voices raised in prayer. These were the ones who chose exile within these walls of suffering, not out of penance alone, but from a resolute conviction that to serve the outcast was to honor the broken body of Christ himself. Leprosy, known in medieval texts as the pale malady, sparked terror across Europe. Misunderstood and thought to be divine punishment, it rendered sufferers untouchable, stripped them of lands and titles, and cast them beyond city walls. Entire settlements, often called lazar houses after St. Lazarus, were erected on the fringes of society. To enter one was, in the eyes of the law, to embrace death. Lepers were declared legally dead, their inheritance forfeited, their names struck from registers. Yet, within these thresholds of despair, faith found its most radical expression. From as early as the 11th century, monastic orders, most notably the Order of St. Lazarus, stepped into the breach. Their origins trace back to Crusader hospitals in Jerusalem, where knights who contracted leprosy formed their own brotherhood. Returning to Europe, they transformed abandoned castles and hermitages into havens of care. Clad not in armor, but in coarse wool, these leper knights offered not martial valor, but medical ministrations, washing foul sores with herbal decoctions and dressing wounds, lest they fester into gangrene. Alongside these knightly orders, mendicant friars, the Franciscans and Dominicans, ventured into the leprosaria. Inspired by gospel injunctions to bind up the wounded, they renounced comfort to dwell among the diseased. Records from 13th century France recount Friar Bertrand of Saint-Jacques, who daily distilled rosemary and lavender into healing oils, whispering benedictions in what little hearing remained of a patient's ears. Brother Guillaume in Lombardy is said to have knelt for hours beside a trembling woman, reciting the Psalms as he applied compresses of ulcer-clearing salves gleaned from ivy and wild thyme. Their tasks were fraught with peril. Lepers, robbed of sensation in many cases, bore festering lesions that emitted a stench so potent it repelled novices ill-prepared for its assault on the senses. Yet the volunteers endured nausea, fever, and swelling joints without complaint. Death claimed more than half of those who toiled within these walls, and many orders kept meticulous obituaries, recording names like Brother Elric and Friar Matilda, struck down by the very affliction they sought to heal. But their sacrifice reaped deeper harvests than cures. By sharing bread and water with those shunned by kin, these clergy restored a shattered humanity. They baptized dying women, prayed at the bedsides of the hopeless, and buried the dead with rites that denied them no passage to eternity. In doing so, they challenged the pervasive notion that lepers had forfeited their immortal souls. Through their sermons, they argued that pity, not punishment, was the proper response to suffering, and that Christ himself sat invisibly at every bedside. The ripple of their example reached far beyond monastery gates. Town councils, previously opposed to funding leprosaria, began to allocate alms and endow lands for their maintenance. Pilgrims en route to Santiago de Compostela often stopped at these institutions, leaving gifts that underwrote medical supplies. Garlic and onion poultices, honey and egg white mixtures, even early forms of mercury ointment, harsh but occasionally effective. In return, the volunteers offered the only thing many lepers possessed: compassion unblunted by fear. As plagues waxed and waned, the role of leper priests and monks evolved. By the 14th century, when another scourge, the Black Death, swept across Europe, the structures of care they had erected became vital bulwarks against indiscriminate death. Though leprosy itself receded, the ethos established by these religious figures infused subsequent orders of hospital brothers and sisters, setting precedents for quarantine, nursing, and dedicated healthcare ministries. Hospitals in Paris and London that treated plague victims owed their institutional memory to the long tradition of service born in the leprosaria. Yet perhaps their greatest legacy lies in the quiet revolution of empathy they kindled. In choosing solidarity over self-preservation, these priests and monks illuminated a path whereby faith transcended dogma and embraced the full spectrum of human suffering. Their bells, once meant to isolate, became calls to conscience, reminders that dignity is not the prerogative of the healthy, but the birthright of every soul. So, as the candle's flame guttered in the leper house chapel and the last chant faded into the stone walls, the lessons endured. In every compassionate touch, in every prayer whispered for the outcast, resounded the timeless truth these volunteers affirmed, that to serve the most broken among us is to heal the heart of humanity itself. St. Lazarus and the Order of Leper Knights. They called themselves brothers, bound not by blood, but by the scar that marked them as outcasts, the telltale signs of leprosy. In the early 12th century, as pilgrims flooded into Jerusalem, a handful of sufferers gathered beyond the city's walls, abandoned by families and stripped of rights. They named their refuge after Lazarus, the beggar whom Christ had raised from death, and in that name they forged a brotherhood unlike any other. Clerics offered prayer, bread, and water, but little could halt the advance of nodules and sores. Yet these men and women discovered purpose in caring for one another. One dressed wounds, another shared bread, and together they found dignity in service. By the 1130s, with guidance from Augustinian canons, the hospice evolved into a formal order. Members took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and pledged to serve as warriors for Christ. Their habit was simple: a rough woolen cloak dyed pale green, bearing an 8-pointed cross in a deeper hue. In 1142, King Fulk granted them land and privileges, and in 1255, Pope Alexander IV confirmed their dual mission with the bull Cum a nobis peritur, acknowledging that the sick could bear arms for the faith. Their martial debut came at Acre in July 1191 during the Third Crusade. Under a scorching sun, the brothers stood beside Templars and Hospitallers, their green crosses glinting in the heat. Chroniclers recount leper knights whose bodies were ravaged by disease and whose limbs trembled with nerve damage, charging enemy lines repeatedly beneath withering arrow fire. They held breaches long enough for fresh Crusader contingents to regroup, their valor inspiring awe and stirring fresh donations from nobles back in Europe. Word of their deeds spread swiftly. Louis VII endowed a commandery at Boigny in 1154, and Henry II followed with Burton Lazars in England. Each new foundation served as hospital and fortress, its halls echoing with the groans of the sick and the clang of armor. Records at Burton describe brothers tending vineyards, baking bread, and on feast days mounting chargers for jousts that raised funds for distant houses. But the crucible of La Forbie in October 1244 sealed their legacy. Facing overwhelming Khwarezmian forces, Crusader hosts formed a desperate line near Gaza. The brothers in the van refused to yield as the center collapsed. They formed a shield wall around retreating archers and noncombatants, steel meeting steel in a grim dance. By day's end, nearly all leper knights lay dead in the dust, their green crosses stained crimson. Survivors' accounts lament their courage and mourn their loss. Despite the bloodshed, the order rebuilt. New recruits came from hospitals across France, Italy, and Germany. In Italy, they established infirmaries from Rome to Milan. In Hungary, they defended frontier strongholds. In Provence, they ministered to pilgrims struck ill en route to the Holy Land. Their network became a web of charity and defense, binding regions in common purpose. Leadership was distinct. Grand masters were elected from among the afflicted, ensuring that those who led carried the wounds of their brethren. Brother Emeric of Marseille, master from 1230 to 1240, oversaw new infirmaries and trained diseased knights in mounted tactics. His letters reveal a man stern in discipline, yet gentle with the dying, whose governance doubled revenues and improved care with early surgical techniques. Critics questioned the mixing of blood and mercy. Preachers warned that the afflicted should not spill blood in holy war, while defenders argued that only by standing firm could the sick protect pilgrims and weakholds. Moreover, the sight of lepers charging into battle moved nobles and commoners alike to donate, sustaining countless hospitals. After Acre fell in 1291, the brothers withdrew first to Cyprus, then Sicily, and finally to Boigny, now a baronial seat. As leprosy waned across Europe, military duties faded and branches merged with other orders. By the 17th century, their role was chiefly charitable, yet their name endures in lazarettos, quarantine stations bearing the echo of their service. Imagine a leper knight at dawn's light, riding across a windswept plain. His armor presses against flesh marred by nodules. Some fingers hang limp, some toes curl in pain. Still he grips his spear as if it were a crucifix, his eyes fixed on banners that beckon him into the fray. He recalls the prayers whispered in infirmary wards, petitions for healing, or failing that, for courage. As he charges, the pale green cross gleams above chaos, a promise that even the broken can stand as bulwarks of faith and compassion. Their story is one of paradox. men scorned by society who became its staunchest defenders, patients who became protectors, in order to find equally by charity and combat. From their scars sprang authority, from their suffering, power. The Order of St. Lazarus stands as living proof that affliction can be transmuted into service, that mercy can march hand in hand with steel, and that even the outcast can become a champion of hope. How France had over 2,000 leprosariums by the 13th century. Imagine a landscape quilted with simple stone chapels and clustered cottages, each bearing a crooked wooden cross at its gate. By the 13th century, France had become a continent unto itself for the afflicted. Over 2,000 leprosaria dotted its fields and roadsides, each a small kingdom of the forgotten. The story begins in the aftermath of the First Crusade, when returning pilgrims, many bearing more than souvenirs, brought back a disease that medieval medicine could neither cure nor fully comprehend. Leprosy, feared as both scourge and stigma, demanded radical solutions. What emerged was not ad hoc containment, but a deliberate church-led crusade of compassion and control on an unprecedented scale. From Paris to Provence, bishops and abbots marshaled resources to erect leper hospitals on lands granted by grateful nobles. Church councils enshrined the duty to care for lepers as a sacred obligation. Papal bulls promised indulgences to anyone who built a lazar house or tended its patients. In 1198, Pope Innocent III issued decrees urging every diocese to establish at least one facility. Wealthy patrons, knighted crusaders, merchant guilds, even entire communes, vied for spiritual merit through endowments. Vineyards, mills, and toll revenues were donated to support the daily bread, ale, and blankets of the leprous, ensuring these institutions could endure through war, famine, and plague. Architecture followed function. Leprosaria typically stood beyond town walls, on sites blessed by local clergy, but separated by distance. A central chapel served as both spiritual heart and social regulator. Only those bearing the sign of the cross and the lead badge could enter its nave, where Mass and prayers for the dying were offered. Surrounding dormitories and infirmaries housed dozens to hundreds of residents. They slept on straw mattresses, ate from shared wooden bowls, and used crutches fashioned from nearby woodlands. Rules forbade touch. A staff-borne bell warned villagers of approaching lepers, preserving the aura of fear that justified the colony's existence. Yet, isolation did not mean neglect. Monastic orders, particularly the Hospitallers and the Order of St. Lazarus, took up the mantle of care with military discipline and hierarchical efficiency. Brothers in white surcoats and green crosses patrolled precincts, administered medicines of honey and herbal poultices, and maintained meticulous records of births, deaths, and benefactions. Lay brothers and sisters, bound by vows of poverty and service, cooked soups, washed linens, and walked the winding corridors at dawn and dusk, chanting psalms to ease suffering bodies and souls alike. Economic factors also fueled the expansion. Medieval France was a patchwork of fiefs and baronies eager to demonstrate piety and earn divine favor. Donating to a leprosarium brought prestige and spiritual insurance. Charters often specified perpetual prayers for benefactors' souls. Some institutions amassed surprising wealth. The Lazare House at Mont-Saint-Aignan, near Rouen, owned vineyards whose vintages funded annual banquets for the poor. Guilds of tanners, shoemakers, and butchers contributed scraps of leather, scraps of meat, and tallow candles, weaving the leprosaria into the economic fabric of their regions. The sheer number, over 2,000 by the 1200s, reflected both genuine charity and social strategy. Authorities understood that uncontrolled contagion threatened urban tax bases and feudal labor. By institutionalizing care, they negotiated a balance between exclusion and obligation. Lepers were legally dead. They could not marry, inherit, or testify in court, yet they were entitled to sustenance and sanctuary. Families sometimes petitioned to have afflicted relatives admitted, exchanging land and goods for renewed protection. Municipal records show that entire parishes pooled funds to build or expand nearby lazar houses, transforming fear into collective responsibility. As the centuries unfolded, the role of these hospitals evolved. Some became centers of medical experimentation, where early universities sent students to study the pathology of leprosy. Others merged with general infirmaries as leprosy's prevalence waned. The Black Death's devastation in the mid-14th century overshadowed leprosy, but quarantine practices and emerging public health measures owed much to the earlier model of isolation. By the late Middle Ages, many former leprosaria had become almshouses, hospices, or parish churches, yet their origins remained etched in local memory. Today's archaeological excavations unearth shards of pilgrim badges stamped with Lazarus, tally sticks recording weekly alms, and skeletal remains showing the bone deformities of advanced disease. Ruined chapels still stand sentinel on misty hills, their moss-covered walls a testament to an age when empathy and exclusion walked hand in hand. In modern France, a handful of medieval laser houses survive as museums or interpretive centers, inviting visitors to contemplate the paradox of care born from fear. As you narrate this chapter of history, let your listeners hear the toll of distant bells across moonlit moors, sense the hush of prayer in austere chapels, and feel the tension between societal protection and human compassion. In the rise of those 2,000 leprosaria, medieval France confronted a profound question. How do we honor the dignity of the most vulnerable when their very presence terrifies us? The answer, written in stone and stained glass, reminds us that out of fear can spring both cruelty and profound mercy, and that the true measure of a civilization lies in how it treats its outcasts. Leprosy as divine punishment, the Church's cruel theology. In the cold candlelight of a medieval sanctuary, the suffering of the body became proof of a corrupted soul. In the minds of many clerics and layfolk alike, the flesh betrayed the spirit. Leprosy was a visible sign of sin, especially the sins of the flesh. Outward rot and decay, the pustules, the scaly lesions, the loss of sensation, were interpreted not as medical phenomena, but as divine verdicts. The Church taught that God's wrath took form in the leprous flesh of sinners, a punishment for hidden transgressions that could no longer be concealed. From the earliest penitential writings, leprosy was equated with moral contagion. Pope Gregory the Great, writing in the late 6th century, likened the disease to the corruption of the heart. Just as leprous skin peeled away, so pride and lust revealed themselves in the soul. By the 9th century, Bishop Burchard of Worms codified this theology. Lepers were to wear distinctive garments, dark robes or coarse sacks, and bear symbols such as a yellow cross or a scapular. Their very appearance in church or at public gatherings served as sermons, warning others of the dangers of carnal indulgence. During Mass, a leper might be permitted to observe from a side chapel or from behind a grill, but only after reciting prayers of penance. Their voices were muffled by handkerchiefs to guard the ears of the faithful from impurity. The Council of Vannes, in 924, decreed that no one should touch a leper's hand during the sign of peace. The Council of Triber in 895 ruled that lepers must fast and pray for longer before confession, as though the rot in their bodies demanded extra atonement. Stories abound in monastic chronicles. A 12th-century monk at Cluny described a knight struck down by leprosy after an indiscreet affair with a noblewoman, a story told as example and deterrent. The knight wandered to the abbey for absolution, but only after public confession of his sins was he allowed to enter the leprosarium. There, in a hall lined with wooden benches, he rang his bell, clink, clink, calling for alms and prayers, each toll affirming his likeness to the sinful soul within. Yet, even as theology judged, the practical administration of these beliefs shaped daily life. In England, the statutes of Winchester in the late 13th century required lepers to leave coins in wooden alms boxes outside leper hospitals, unable to beg face to face. In Normandy, royal edicts mandated that lepers dwell at least a mile from city walls. The Church endorsed these measures, seeing separation as both spiritual discipline and social hygiene. Lepers were to learn humility through isolation, their exclusion mirroring the distance between penitent sinners and divine grace. Artistic representations reinforced the message. Illuminated manuscripts depicted lepers with unkempt hair and ragged garments, often shown beneath dark arches, their halos scornful parodies of saintly radiance. Mystery plays cast leprous characters as both villains and victims, their deformities dramatized to underscore moral lessons. In one 15th century French drama, a leper who refuses to repent is struck down, while a penitent leper is granted a miraculous cure, an overt allegory of sin and redemption. Paradoxically, the same church that condemned the leper's body also provided some of its only care. Orders such as St. Lazarus, St. Giles, and the Order of the Holy Ghost established leprosaria across Europe, staffed by monks and nuns who tended the sick. These institutions combined judgment with charity. Chaplains preached sermons on sin, but physicians and herbalists administered poultices of rue, rosemary, and myrtle to soothe sores. The rule of St. Benedict exhorted monks to visit the sick as if they were Christ incarnate, blurring the lines between punishment and compassion. In sermons, leprosy served as a theological mirror. "Behold your sin," preachers intoned, "laid bare on flesh." The disease embodied the Old Testament's lessons: Miriam's leprous skin after questioning Moses, Gehazi's affliction for greed, tying medieval sinners to biblical parable. Yet, when epidemics like the Black Death ravaged all ranks, even the holy fell to plague and leprosy alike, unsettling clergy who once saw disease as selective wrath. Confraternities of flagellants marched through towns, beating their backs and wearing garments of sackcloth, yet they too fell victim, shattering the certainty that affliction marked the sinful. By the late Middle Ages, mercy began to temper judgment. In 1300, Clement V granted indulgences to those who visited leper hospitals on certain feast days, and Franciscan friars begged in streets not to shun but to aid the afflicted. Medical treatises of the Renaissance would eventually recognize leprosy as a distinct disease, morbid anatomy replacing moralizing doctrine. Yet the legacy of the Church's cruel theology endured. Laws once written to punish would persist in attitudes toward leprosy well into the 17th century. Reflecting on this history, we see a society wrestling with fear of sin, fear of contagion, fear of bodies that betrayed hidden guilt. The Church's theology cast leprosy as divine punishment, but it also created space for mercy, however begrudging. In the clash of judgment and compassion, we glimpse the complexity of medieval faith, where care could be both cruel and kind. The lessons echo today. Visible suffering need not signal moral failure, and our responses to disease must balance accountability with empathy, lest we toll the bell of condemnation where mercy alone should ring. The Leprosy Edict of 1179 from the Third Lateran Council. Imagine the grand hall of the Lateran Palace in March of 1179, sunlight filtering through colored glass, casting mosaic patterns on marble floors worn smooth by centuries of feet. Cardinals in crimson robes gather in solemn assembly, flanked by bishops and abbots, their voices low but urgent. The Third Lateran Council has convened under Pope Alexander III to address the crises that trouble Christendom: heresy, schism, and unexpectedly, the scourge of leprosy that has spread terror through towns and villages. News from the north speaks of whole hamlets emptied, once vibrant marketplaces now silent. The Church, entrusted with both spiritual care and social order, resolves it must act. On the morning of the Council's 16th session, a decree is read aloud: the Leprosy Edict of 1179. No flourish of trumpets heralds it, only the steady cadence of Latin intoned by a learned cardinal. The words ring down the nave like a hammer on an anvil. Lepers are to be set apart, living apart, removed from the common ways of the faithful, that none may suffer harm or fear. In that moment, lepers are transformed in law and ritual from afflicted humans into a separate class, bound by strict rules. They are forbidden entry into city walls unless en route to a leprosarium. They must wear distinguishing garments, a hood of coarse cloth, and a badge bearing the letters LEPRA. and they must carry a wooden clapper or bell to strike before every step, announcing their approach. This edict is more than a medical ordinance. It codifies theological anxieties. In medieval thought, leprosy resonates with the Old Testament's affliction upon King Uzziah and Miriam's punishment for envy, visible signs of hidden sins. By clustering the afflicted in designated quarters, the Church aims both to quarantine bodies and to purify the community. Yet even here, compassion is woven into the decree. The council mandates that leprosaria be established near convents or monasteries where clergy and lay brothers will tend to spiritual needs. Alms boxes are to be set at cathedral doors, their proceeds reserved for the care of the exiled. A gentle note in the canons exhorts the faithful, "Neglect not to show mercy to those whom Christ has borne as his own cross." The enforcement of the edict unfolds with stark drama. In Aquitaine, a royal communique ensures that sheriffs will escort lepers from hamlets to the newly built lazaret outside Bordeaux, summoning reluctant families to part with kin. In Lombardy, citizens petition local bishops for clear guidelines on bell-ringing distances. How many paces must a leper's clapper sound before a door is closed? Monastic chronicles record small rebellions, a leper who dared to enter a chapel, a farmer who hid his afflicted wife behind barn walls to spare her exile. These acts of defiance are met with fines or, in extreme cases, excommunication. Despite the rigid framework, the lived reality of segregation is uneven. Some leprosaria grow into complex communities with their own chapels, infirmaries, and gardens where the sick cultivate herbs. Records from the Abbey of Clairvaux describe Brother Odo, leprous yet devout, who wrote heartfelt letters to his former novices, pleading for news of the world he once served. Other colonies falter. Lacking funds, they become squalid camps where despair breeds as contagion thrives. Pilgrims who once journeyed to Santiago de Compostela now pause en route to leave coins and prayers at leper crossroads. The edict's echo is felt beyond immediate health care by removing legal rights, property ownership, marriage contracts, inheritance. The Church places lepers in a perpetual state of dependency. A widow declared leprous loses her dowry. An heir struck by the disease sees his lands confiscated by feudal lords. The lines between spiritual penance and social punishment blur. Yet in this harshness, the medieval mind sees divine justice balanced by mercy. Exile is couched as a penance that, if borne with humility, promises heavenly reward. Over the decades that follow, councils and local synods reaffirm and refine the 1179 decree. In 1204, the Fourth Lateran Council orders even stricter clothing for the afflicted, a conspicuous cross sewn on sash and sleeve that all might recognize the soul in need. By the mid-13th century, hospitals rise across France, England, and the German principalities, each tracing its founding charter to Alexander's edict. Some of these institutions will survive the Black Death, their walls standing as silent witnesses to centuries of charity and fear intertwined. Yet time softens the edges of decree. Renaissance humanists question the morality of segregation. Ecclesiastical reformers argue for reintegration of the healed. Secular rulers facing labor shortages in the wake of plague reconsider the utility of ostracized workers. By the 15th century, the stark divisions mandated in 1179 begin to crumble. Some leper houses accept non-leprous companions, believing that solidarity heals as much as medicine. When we cast our gaze back across 800 years, the Leprosy Edict of 1179 emerges as a landmark of medieval social policy. It stands at the crossroads of faith and fear, law and charity, sealing the fate of thousands in rituals of exclusion. It reminds us how societies, gripped by the unknown, may erect walls around suffering rather than confront it within. And yet, within these walls, stories of compassion, of lepers who tended brothers in the infirmary, of prayers whispered at dusk, endure. In remembering the edict, we witness both the perils of othering and the persistent striving of human hearts toward mercy. How Norway's last leper hospital stayed open until the 20th century. A lone gull wheels above the slate rooftops of Bergen, its cry echoing against the fjord's granite walls. Below, tucked behind weathered timber houses and narrow cobblestone lanes, stands the unassuming stone edifice of St. Jørgen's Hospital. For over 5 centuries, this austere complex bore witness to the outcasts of Norwegian society, lepers whose names disappeared from parish registers and whose very existence was deemed shameful. Yet, while the rest of Europe abandoned its leprosaria as cures emerged, St. Jørgen's endured, its heavy wooden gates creaking open as late as 1946. How could a hospital devoted to a disease rendered treatable by modern medicine persist into the age of radio broadcasts and mustard gas? The story begins in the chilling sweep of the Little Ice Age, around 1411, when Norway's coastal communities braced against hunger, cold, and epidemics. Leprosy, then endemic across the North Atlantic, fed on weakened bodies. In Bergen, a thriving Hanseatic trading port, merchants arriving from the British Isles and continental Europe unwittingly carried Mycobacterium leprae aboard their vessels. The first records of contagion among local fishermen and farmhands prompted the city council to carve out a peninsula by the Vagan harbor, erecting wooden hovels ringed by high palings. Here, infected families lived in enforced exile, subsisting on government rations, subsided by church collections, but deprived of all civic rights. Amid this grim segregation, the church saw both a spiritual duty and an opportunity for piety. St. Jørgen's took its name from St. George, the dragon slayer, an emblem of hope for those beset by an unseen enemy. Initially managed by Augustinian canonesses, the hospital offered rudimentary care: herbal baths of juniper and chamomile, poultices of birch tar, and the occasional miracle touch from pilgrims convinced of the saint's intercession. Still, mortality hovered near 90% within the first months of admission. The Church's reward was repentance, writ in suffering. But to many lepers, it meant unyielding despair. By the late 16th century, Norway's Reformation swept away monastic orders, transferring St. Jørgen's to secular magistrates. Yet the hospital did not wither under the crown's oversight. Rather, it expanded. Stone wings replaced rickety huts, stockades gave way to iron-barred windows, and isolation became containment. Inhabitants, stripped of surnames and often assigned numbers, cultivated vegetable plots, and tended livestock within the hospital walls, striving for a semblance of autonomy. Physicians from Copenhagen visited sporadically, applying mercury ointments and advising on diet for the diseased. Lean fish, oatmeal gruel, and juniper-infused spirits believed to cleanse the blood. The 19th century brought seismic shifts. Across Europe, Jean-Alphonse Lutz and G. Armauer Hansen identified the leprosy bacillus, and treatments such as chalmugra oil offered real hope, lowering relapse rates. Norway, too, embraced progress. In 1905, chalmugra injections became standard, and by the 1920s, sulfone drugs entered clinical trials. Elsewhere, leprosaria closed as curative regimens shortened hospital stays. Yet Bergen resisted. Why did St. Jørgen's remain open when Oslo's adjacent institution shuttered its wards? Economic entanglements provided part of the answer. The hospital's lands, gifted by wealthy merchants and maintained by statewide endowments, yielded timber and fish rights that enriched the city treasury. Closing St. Jørgen's threatened lost revenue, a reality fiercely guarded by local officials. Moreover, Norway's rugged terrain and scattered population complicated patient relocation. Upwards of 200 individuals, many elderly and debilitated after decades of confinement, had no homes to return to. The state lacked resources to reintegrate them, and social attitudes toward contagion still carried deep-seated fear. Within the gray walls, another force kept the doors open: the staff's unwavering solidarity. Generations of nurses and orderlies, often drawn from Bergen's devout families, saw St. Jørgen's not as a death camp, but as a community. Elderly residents recalled childhood friends living beyond the gates who vanished into anonymity once they fell ill. For the hospital's inhabitants, this enclave was home, wretched though it was, a place where someone still greeted them by name. The staff organized church services in half-ruined chapels, sponsored music evenings with fiddle tunes and psalms, and allowed Sunday markets where lepers bartered farm produce among themselves. This fragile social fabric crumbled only when modern authorities insisted on closure. In 1946, 4 years after cell phone treatments eradicated new infections, Norway's health ministry decreed St. Jurgen's obsolete. Bulldozers tore through infirmaries that had seen the dying and the damned alike. Remaining patients, some in their 70s and 80s, were transferred to municipal nursing homes. Others, too frail to move, died in place. The gates, once a barrier between health and disease, rusted shut. By 1950, the last whispers of St. Jurgen's faded from living memory. Today, the hospital's skeletal ruins stand as tombstones etched with lessons. The dangers of stigmatizing disease, the power of institutional inertia, and the quiet heroism of caregivers who refuse to abandon the afflicted. Archaeological digs have uncovered amphorae of herbal infusions, frayed rosaries, and lead pipes once carrying heated baths. In Bergen's museum, sepia photographs capture gaunt faces framed by grim determination, snapshots of souls who, despite exile, found dignity in companionship. So when the evening tide laps the crumbling walls and tourists pause to glimpse the shuttered windows, let them remember that St. Jurgen's Hospital was not merely the last bastion of medieval fear, but a testament to human endurance. It serves as a reminder that even when a cure is found, the battle for compassion may linger, echoing in stone corridors long after the bells have ceased their toll. The leper masses, where diseased attendees sat outside the church walls. They gathered at dawn's light, huddled in ragged cloaks against the dew-soaked grass, their flesh softened by disease and cruelty. Beyond the grand portal of the parish church stood the outcasts, men and women marked by leprosy, banished from the sanctity within by fear and ritual law. They had no pews, no altar rail to kneel before, no incense drifting into their nostrils. Instead, they pressed their ears to narrow lunette openings cut into the thick stone walls, small slit-like windows called leper holes, or sheltered beneath crude wooden canopies erected just beyond the consecrated ground. Here, in the chill air of early morning, they would share in the Mass, their voices rising in muffled responses, their souls drawn toward the same mysteries that filled the nave. The practice of segregated leper masses emerged across Western Christendom in the 12th century, as outbreaks of Hansen's disease spread like shadow across the countryside. Church councils and episcopal synods grappled with conflicting injunctions. Lepers were unclean, yet baptized, separated by law, yet called to receive communion. Canon Law of 1163 forbade those blemished by contagion from entering sacred precincts. Yet pastoral letters insisted that no soul, however afflicted, be denied the Eucharist. The compromise was architectural. Build leper chapels against the outer walls, carve listening slits into stone, and train priests to deliver consecrated wine via long-handled spoons or hollow reeds, ensuring that the host passed from hand to trembling hand at a distance. On feast days, troops of devoted lay brothers led the condemned processionally from leprosaria, hospices located beyond city gates, toward the main church. They bore crucifixes and banners veiled in white, symbols of both purity and death. Clad in simple tunics, their faces ghostly pale beneath hooded cowls, the lepers filed into makeshift benches carved from old wagon wheels and broken choir stalls repurposed for them. Above, on a raised dais inside, the celebrant intoned the introit, his voice resonant within vaulted arches. Outside, only the faint echo reached the cramped assembly. Sometimes a single chanter's voice would rise above the murmur, an act of devotion and defiance, a reminder that they too belonged to the body of Christ. Liturgical texts were adapted. Prayers beseeched God's mercy on the afflicted brethren. Collect formulas inserted specific petitions for healing or grace to endure suffering. When the gospel was proclaimed, A deacon stood at one of the wall's narrow slits, reading aloud to the listeners beyond. The brighter the sunlight, the sharper the contrast between light and shadow, as though heaven's grace itself trickled through those small openings. Parishioners inside turned to seek the glow, sensing that salvation pressed against the same stones that held the leper's breath. Communion posed its greatest challenge. The doctrine of transubstantiation demanded that the faithful consume Christ's body and blood. Yet contact with leprous lips was taboo. The solution was ingenious. Priests fashioned long wooden spoons or communion rods tipped with linen thongs. The host was placed upon the linen. The leper stooped to draw it gently in, avoiding direct touch. In some regions they used hollow silver tubes through which the wine was sipped, the tube washed afterward with holy water. The ritual was solemn and slow. Lines snaked along the wall, and often midday sunlight glinted off metal spoons as though divine light itself blessed the contrivance. Chroniclers noted the scene with a mixture of awe and pity. A 12th century monk at Clairvaux wrote that watching the lepers clasped their emaciated hands in prayer, their eyes lifted to the high windows they could not enter, was to see faith incarnate in flesh destined to decay. Pilgrims who witnessed these masses carried tales back to distant lands, spurring donations for leprosaria and prompting wealthy patrons to found new chapels. By the 14th century, some cathedrals, Chartres, Reims, and Winchester among them, had dedicated leper chapels with their own altars and stained glass, where the lepers could glimpse symbols of redemption painted in jewel-like hues, albeit from the outside. Yet segregation took its toll. The barrier that separated body also separated community. Lepers lived in perpetual limbo, spiritually nourished, yet physically exiled. They heard the bells ringing from within, but could not join in processions or candlelit vigils. They received the word, but could not partake in fellowship. Their mortality was a daily sermon. As one passed away beyond the wall, his body was collected in wicker baskets and borne to hurried graves in unconsecrated ground. The living yellowed with isolation, bound to their spots outside the church, turning each Mass into both feast and lament. Reformers of the 15th century decried the humiliation. Humanist theologians argued that charity demanded full inclusion, and some urban councils ordered chapels built adjacent to leprosaria with independent clergy. Yet entrenched prejudice persisted. Even as plague and disease ravaged cities, leper holes remained, silent witnesses to a world still fearful of touch. In remote hamlets, rustic stonework survived the Reformation and the French Revolution. Today, one may still see the narrow openings carved into medieval walls, small gatekeepers of a ritual both tender and cruel. In imagination, one might walk along the cloister of a 13th century cathedral at Vézelay. On your left, sunlight pours through great rose windows onto polished flagstones. On your right, beneath a lean-to roof, a cluster of ragged figures leans forward, eyes closed, lips parted in the Kyrie eleison. A priest inside lifts the host. The echoes swell. A bird flies by, and for a moment the world seems split between two realms, one of stone and shadow, the other of flesh and hope. Then the lepers pass the communion spoon from trembling hand to trembling hand, their blessings whispered into the winter air. In that act resides the paradox of their faith. Cast out, yet called in, shunned, yet sanctified, their silence beneath the slits a louder proclamation of devotion than any trumpet blast. Thus the leper masses endured as testament to human perseverance and divine grace. The walls that barred entry became the very vessels of inclusion, reminding all who watched that the Church's arms must stretch beyond thresholds of fear. In every narrow slit, in every wooden spoon, lay the promise that no darkness of body could extinguish the light of the soul. Medieval laws that banned lepers from bridges, markets, and wells. In the winding streets of medieval towns, beside the arched spans of stone bridges and the bustling stalls of open-air markets, a silent decree shaped daily life. Those marked by leprosy were forbidden from places where bread was broken, coins exchanged, or water drawn. Fear of contagion, mingled with moral judgments, drove civic leaders to enact ordinances that consigned lepers to the margins of society, barred from wells, forbidden on bridges, and banned from marketplaces. Imagine a weary traveler approaching a bridge that spans a swift river. He pauses at the wooden gate, grips the iron latch, and reads the painted sign, "No lepers beyond this point." Thousands of pilgrims crossing Europe's rivers encountered similar bans. The rationale was simple and relentless. Where many feet trod and food was carried, disease must be kept at bay. In Toulouse, city council records from 1228 decree that any person exhibiting signs of leprosy, white patches on skin, loss of sensation, must not cross the Pont Neuf. Gatekeepers were instructed to demand proof of health, a grim ritual that left the afflicted stranded on the wrong bank, forced to beg for passage or find secret fords. Markets proved no safer haven. In Dijon, an ordinance of 1241 forbade leprous individuals from entering the Grand Hall, where cloth merchants displayed bolts of wool and silk. Town criers announced that anyone with the white sickness caught among the stalls would face fines and public humiliation. Vendors, afraid that the mere touch of a coin or the breath of a diseased throat could taint their goods, supported these strictures. Some towns issued special tokens for healthy beggars, a small wooden tag or metal badge, to distinguish them from those barred by law. Lepers who dared to ignore the ban risked being chased away, beaten, or forcibly removed by town guards. Perhaps the most critical exclusion involved water sources. In an age before modern sanitation, wells stood at the heart of civic life. Drawn by buckets, their clear depth sustained families, inns, and livestock. Legislation in cities such as Utrecht, 1256, and Rouen, 1273, explicitly forbade lepers from approaching communal wells. Officials posted watchmen who peered down stone shafts, ensuring that no bucket drawn by diseased hands touched the communal rope. In some villages, separate wells were dug beyond the town walls for the use of the afflicted, grim reminders of their enforced separation. These leper wells offered tainted compassion. Access to water, yes, but only at the cost of perpetual marginalization. The reasons for these bans rested on a mixture of practical concern, religious symbolism, and social control. Leprosy's slow progression and visible symptoms made it a terrifying specter. Medieval medical texts warned that its contagion could spread through contact or even proximity. Canon law echoed these fears, depicting lepers as living parables of sin and divine judgment. Secular authorities seeking to protect trade, public health, and civic order found in exclusion a straightforward solution. Yet exclusion was also a form of social theater. Lepers, forced to wear identifying badges and carry bells, became living embodiments of the community's anxieties and its charity. Despite their isolation, many cities recognized an obligation of care. Some ordinances required that townspeople leave alms for lepers at designated beggars' niches, carved into walls near bridges or market entrances. In Milan, a 1282 statute stipulated that any merchant passing a leper-lined lane must drop a loaf of bread into a wooden trough. In exchange for this minimal compassion, lepers agreed to stay clear of fresh provisions and public gatherings, sealing a pact of separation in which fear and mercy coexisted uneasily. Over time, as medical understanding evolved and leprosy's prevalence declined, these bans faded. Quarantine measures refined during later plague outbreaks borrowed from the earlier model of exclusion, but applied more uniformly. By the late Middle Ages, the legal distinction between lepers and other infirm had blurred, and many former leper bridges and leper wells returned to common use. Yet in stone carvings and archival decrees, the memory endures of an era when fear of the unseen drove laws that turned community lifeblood, water, food, trade, into instruments of separation. As you guide your audience through this chapter of medieval life, invite them to hear the clang of bronze bells warning of approaching lepers, to feel the chill of stone walls that denied access, and to imagine the burdens of those forced to linger beyond the communal hearth. These ordinances remind us that the lines drawn by fear can shape human experience as profoundly as any map, and that the story of public health is inseparable from the story of social exclusion. The chilling burial practices for lepers. In the gray hush of a medieval dawn, the wail of funeral bells gives way to a harsher silence where lepers' coffins are laid to rest. For the afflicted, death did not bring the comfort of consecrated ground. Instead, their bodies were dragged beyond sacred churchyards to be burned in pyres or buried in unblessed soil, exiled even in death. The rites reserved for Christian souls were denied them, their remains treated as contagion rather than carriers of eternal hope. This was the chilling final chapter in a life already marked by isolation. Across Europe, from the rolling hills of Normandy to the marshlands of East Anglia, local ordinances codified this grim separation. In Paris, lepers were banned from Saint-Germain-des-Prés cemetery. Their corpses were consigned to a plot at the city's edge, where a low wooden cross marked the boundary between purity and disease. By the 12th century, the cathedral chapter's records in Chartres ordered that leper graves lie at least a stone's throw from consecrated ground in soil deemed ritually impure. The church's grave-digging teams, armed with shovels and pitchforks, worked quickly at dawn to avoid contact, throwing earth over the coffin without prayer, without lament. In some regions, burning was thought to purify the tainted flesh. On barren hillocks or at lonely crossroads, pyres were lit under gray skies, the crackle of burning wood mingling with the shriek of crows. Church councils, seeking to protect living believers from spiritual corruption, sanctioned these rites. The Council of Mainz in 1049 decreed that non-lepers stood too close in death as in life. To bury a leper alongside the faithful was to risk contaminating holy ground. Smoke and flame became a grim liturgy, an act of obliteration rather than transition. Monastic chroniclers described the nightmarish scenes. A 13th-century monk at Canterbury recounted how leper bodies, wrapped only in coarse shrouds, were carried on wheeled carts to a field outside the city walls. There, a low mound of ashes marked the spot. As the wind carried the scent of burning flesh across the fields, villagers crossed themselves and hurried indoors. Even carrion birds avoided the sight, leaving the ashen hillock eerily still. In Toledo, Spain, Muslim and Christian authorities both grappled with these burials. Islamic law, which demanded burial, clashed with Christian superstition. As a compromise, leper graves were dug within cemeteries but deep, buried in unclean pits sealed with lime to hasten decay and prevent the stench from rising. Lime itself, believed to seal off evil, became part of the funeral rite, its crisp white dust a mockery of the purity it could not restore. Pilgrim accounts shed further light. Those en route to Santiago de Compostela described leper burial grounds marked by clusters of stones carved with crosses and the names of the dead. Pilgrims left coins and scraps of cloth, hoping their offerings would soften the fate of souls denied Mass and absolution. The stones bore inscriptions like, Domine miserere, Lord have mercy, silent petitions from the living to God for mercy on the dead. Fear drove much of this cruelty. Medieval medicine, rooted in humoral theory, insisted that disease could linger in decaying flesh. The specter of post-mortem infection spread through rumor. If a corpse's skin bubbled or its mouth foamed, villagers believed the leprous dead sought to rise again. Grave watchers were posted at night, armed with torches and stakes to guard against supposed revenants. In some alpine valleys, leper bones were exhumed when plague struck, thrown into rivers to wash away evil, their significance reduced to a threat carried downstream. Yet theology offered a paradox. Christ himself had healed lepers. His touch was salvation. Many clergy spoke of leper burial with sorrow, lamenting the Church's harshness. The Order of St. Lazarus, dedicated to caring for lepers, maintained its own cemeteries adjacent to hospitals where lepers could receive Christian burial rites. Here, beneath humble crosses, bones rested in consecrated earth, and monks sang requiems for the souls of the outcast. Such sanctuaries were rare beacons of mercy amid widespread condemnation. As Gothic cathedrals soared skyward, their walls echoed with the theology that both banished lepers and called believers to charity. Preachers reminded congregations that judgment belonged to God alone, urging alms for those buried unblessed. Yet laws changed slowly. It was not until the Renaissance, when medical advances distinguished leprosy from other decaying diseases, that burial customs eased. By the 16th century, the edicts condemning leper corpses to unholy ground were quietly repealed in many dioceses, replaced with regulations for proper interment. Archaeological excavations today uncover these forsaken burial sites. Shallow graves in marshy fields, clusters of bones lying side by side, skulls stained by lime. Anthropologists piece together the narratives of those denied Christian burial, dating remains by shards of pottery or fragments of coffin wood. Each discovery revives the memory of a life and death marked by fear. Reflecting on these chilling practices, we confront the power of stigma and the danger of letting fear dictate our rites for the dead. The leper's burial, buried in unblessed plots, exiled beyond the cemetery wall, was the final act in a tragedy of isolation. As modern societies wrestle with outbreaks and pandemics, the medieval response to leprosy reminds us that compassion must guide our treatment of the vulnerable in life and in death. And how leprosy was confused with other diseases like psoriasis and syphilis. Imagine a wandering pilgrim arriving at a city gate in the 12th century, his skin marked by scaly red patches that glint in the sunlight. He bears no other signs of illness, no wasting of flesh, no loss of sensation. But the moment the guards glimpse his lesions, they retreat in horror. Within hours, the pilgrim finds himself expelled beyond the walls, destined for the leprosarium far outside town. Yet he does not suffer from leprosy at all. His blackened plaques are psoriasis, a chronic skin condition unknown to medieval healers. In a world where medical knowledge is scarce and fear runs deep, such confusions were all too common, and the consequences could be devastating. From the earliest records of leprosy in Europe, scribes and physicians struggled to distinguish it from other maladies. Ancient Greek and Roman texts described elephantiasis, massive swelling of limbs, and deformities caused by filarial worms. Early Christian writers conflated these accounts with accounts of the biblical leper, leading to a broad, imprecise definition. Any chronic skin ailment paired with social stigma fell under the umbrella of leprosy. The Latin term lepra encompassed everything from vitiligo, which causes white patches, to psoriasis with its silvery scales. In the Islamic world of the 10th century, the polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, which attempted to classify skin diseases. He differentiated lepra vera from other dermatoses, noting the loss of feeling in leprous lesions. Yet, many practitioners lack the nuance to apply these distinctions. A noblewoman in Cordoba, observed Ibn Sina, could suffer a scaly rash and be mistaken for a leper, her family's honor and inheritance jeopardized by misunderstanding. As centuries passed, syphilis joined the list of lookalikes. When the so-called French disease erupted across Europe around 1495, its pustules and sores were often attributed to leprosy, or vice versa. In 16th century Venice, city magistrates recorded cases of lupera, a term used interchangeably for both conditions. Patients waiting outside the lazaretto would shout to passers-by, insisting, "I have not that cursed pox." Yet their pleas fell on deaf ears. Both diseases required isolation, and both stained the soul with moral taint. Legal codes codified these confusions. In England, the Statute of Westminster, 1285, gave justices the power to banish anyone showing signs of leprosy or any like contagion. The phrase, "or any like contagion," proved remarkably elastic. A mason with a stubborn eczema flare was forced to wear torn garments and ring a bell as he walked the streets of Canterbury. Monastic records from Durham Abbey lament a brother expelled on account of a misdiagnosed facial rash, later identified as lupus vulgaris, a form of tuberculosis affecting the skin. Beyond Europe, colonial encounters intensified misdiagnosis. In the 19th century, British officials in India used the term leprosy to label a range of chronic ailments among the populace, from elephantiasis, gricorum, to cutaneous tuberculosis. Under the Indian Leprosy Act of 1898, entire villages could be quarantined if leprosy cases were suspected. An ethnographic survey from Madras in 1903 recounts a woman diagnosed by a colonial surgeon simply because her keloid scars resembled lepromatous nodules. She spent years in a segregation camp separated from her children before a later physician recognized her condition as post-burn contracture scars. The 1873 discovery of Mycobacterium leprae by Dr. Gerhard Armauer Hansen clarified the bacteriological cause of true leprosy. Yet laboratory tests were scarce and clinical overlap with syphilis persisted. Syphilitic gumas, granulomatous lesions, could mimic lepromatous nodules, and psoriatic plaque sometimes harbored secondary bacterial infection, deepening the confusion. Even into the early 20th century, skin specialists relied on leper-min reactions and microscopic examination. Simple microscopy was not always available in remote colonial outposts. The human toll of these errors was immense. Physicians in Brazil recounted patients confined for decades only to be released when cured of syphilis after mercury treatments. In Norway, official statistics from the 1920s revealed that nearly 40% of those institutionalized in the notorious Bergen leprosarium never harbored M. leprae. Their leprosy proved to be psoriasis, fungal infections, or even post-traumatic skin changes. Folklore among the inmates spoke of the false lepers, desperate souls who had lost family, property, and livelihood to medical misjudgment. Within leprosaria, the bonds between truly afflicted and misdiagnosed created complex social dynamics. Some inmates shared rumors that only the most distressed would shout, "Test me for the itch," hoping to distinguish genuine from spurious cases. Clergy who visited these houses sometimes petitioned for reviews of diagnoses. A letter from a priest in Lombardy, circa 1605, pleads, "Spare these innocents the agony of exile, if no true affliction rots their flesh." By mid-20th century, modern antimicrobial treatments, dapsone, rifampicin, offered effective cures for Hansen's disease and improved dermatological knowledge, sharpened differential diagnosis. Psoriasis clinics and syphilis testing centers reduced the broad strokes of medieval and colonial statutes to precise clinical protocols. Yet the shadow of historical misdiagnosis lingers. Even today, individuals in parts of Africa and Asia report stigma when psoriasis or vitiligo is mistaken for leprosy by community health workers. Reflecting on this tangled history, we confront the peril of labeling human suffering without rigorous understanding. Misdiagnosis amplified fear, isolated the innocent, and codified social exclusion in law and ritual. The confusion between leprosy and its lookalikes reminds us that medical authority can both heal and harm. As modern viewers, we must listen to those silenced by error, acknowledge the legacy of ostracism, and ensure that compassion guides diagnosis as much as science. In doing so, we honor not only the struggles of the truly afflicted, but also the unintended victims of a past blinded by fear. This legacy calls us to vigilance, reminding us that every rash, every lesion, carries a story deserving of truth rather than assumption. The leper windows built into monasteries and churches. Imagine a weathered stone wall rising against the pale morning light, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Embedded within that wall, barely noticeable, are slim vertical slits, just wide enough for an outstretched hand, a pair of eyes, or a prayerful lips to press against. These were the leper windows, humble portals carved into monasteries and churches across medieval Europe, a quiet testament to both exclusion and inclusion, to fear and mercy. They stand at knee-height or eye level, depending on the site, each one a silent witness to society's struggle with a disease that was as much spiritual trial as physical affliction. Leprosy in the Middle Ages carried profound symbolic weight. Thinkers of the time saw the disease as evidence of divine punishment, a visible manifestation of sin upon the body. Lepers were declared dead in civil eyes, stripped of property and status, forced into isolation in lazar houses, or wandering under papal decrees. Yet Christian doctrine insisted that the church should care for the least among its flock. To reconcile the demands of purity with the injunction to love one's neighbor, ecclesiastical authorities devised a compromise: the leper window. Through these narrow slits, lepers could gaze upon the consecrated host, hear the choir's ethereal hymns, and receive the Eucharist, all without crossing the threshold into hallowed space. In the 12th century, as monasticism flourished, abbeys and parish churches began incorporating these windows into new constructions. At Saint-Georges de Didon in southwestern France, a low window near the chapel apse opened onto a small courtyard where infirmed souls clustered at dawn. A mounted wooden box, often lined with cloth, served as a makeshift altar extension. Priests, with gloved hands, slipped the wafer into the box's compartment and gently pushed it through. Across the continent, from the Cistercian abbeys of England to the hilltop churches of northern Italy, similar designs appeared: vertical slits framed by stone mullions or curved in simple arch. Their consistency speaks to a widespread ecclesiastical consensus. Lepers must be physically separated, yet spiritually embraced. Archaeological remnants reveal further variations. In Catalonia, some windows were positioned high on external cloister walls, covered by hinged shutters that could be opened only when a priest approached. In Germany's Rhineland, a handful of churches feature dual windows, one at standing height for able-bodied observers, another lower for those who could not stand long. At Trier, fragments of painted inscriptions survive above a now-blocked leper window. "Venerunt ad Dominum," they read, "they came to the Lord." A poignant reminder that these individuals sought not charity alone, but communion with the divine. Yet the use of leper windows was more than an architectural curiosity. It reflected evolving attitudes toward contagion. Early medieval practice demanded total segregation. Lepers walked barefoot with bells around their necks, their homes distant from towns. By the 13th century, medical theories advanced by figures like Bernard de Gordon suggested that distance alone did not guarantee safety, leading to stricter quarantine within leprosaria. Churches responded by walling off aisles and cloisters, rerouting pilgrim routes, and crafting separate entrances. In this context, the leper window became a controlled point of contact, designed to prevent accidental touch, airborne transmission, or mingling of crowds, yet enabling a vital right to cross that divide. Priests themselves grappled with tension between fear and duty. Canon law insisted on the administration of sacraments to all baptized souls, regardless of ailment. True, some clergy balked at drawing near the afflicted. Accounts survive of priests donning hooded garments and carrying long alms sticks to maintain distance. But others, particularly mendicant orders, embraced service to the sick as a path to sanctity. Friar Thomas of York, writing circa 1280, described kneeling at a leper window as a lesson in humility to serve Christ in his most deformed form. His sermons urged townsfolk to pray for the souls beyond the walls, to offer charity from afar, and to recognize in the pale faces the image of the suffering Savior. Over time, leper windows faded as leprosy declined. The 14th century Black Death ravaged Europe with far greater speed, causing some leprosaria to be repurposed or abandoned. By the 16th century, improved medical treatments and changing social structures rendered the leper window obsolete. Many were sealed or built over. Some were repurposed as confessionals or storage niches. Yet a handful remain at Saint-Remy in Reims, at Santa Maria della Pieve in Arezzo, at St. Giles Hospital in Norwich, silent, slender apertures that outlasted centuries of ignorance and fear. Today, when sunlight filters through these ancient slits, illuminating the dust motes of empty chapels, one can almost hear the echoes of distant prayers. Each window is a testament to a fragile balance, the Church's fear of defilement tempered by its call to embrace the outcast. In their narrow confines lies a profound paradox, a barrier that both separated and connected, a stone conduit of grace for those deemed beyond hope. These windows remind us that compassion often travels through the smallest openings, and that to build walls is human, but to fashion doorways for the suffering, divine. Lepers in the Crusades, fighting for redemption. They rode forth beneath ragged banners, their cloaks stained by disease and sacrifice, each man and woman marked by the cruel hand of leprosy. In the year of our Lord 1191, when Richard Plantagenet's banners snapped in the Levantine wind and the walls of Acre trembled under the weight of Crusader hopes, there strode into the fray a company unlike any other. Knights and foot soldiers who bore not only swords and shields, but the very scourge they sought to transcend. For these were the afflicted who saw in battle a path to redemption, lepers who traded infirmity for iron, finding in the clash of arms an escape from spiritual exile. The Church taught that penance could wash away sins, but some believed that the stigma of leprosy was a penance heavier than most. Canonical decrees barred them from sacraments within stone walls, yet sanctioned their service in warfare as an expiation that surpassed prayer. In the shrines and chapter houses of the Holy Sepulchre, bishops and grand masters debated whether the afflicted might bear arms. It was Pope Innocent III, in a rare concession, who granted that those wasting in flesh could take the cross and wield the lance for Christendom's defense, provided they carried a witness of their suffering, a red cross on white, reversed of the martyr's emblem, to show both penitence and purpose. Among those who answered the call, none were more renowned than the brothers of St. Lazarus. Born in a hospice at Jerusalem's edge, they swore vows of poverty and obedience, yet took up the sword when war summoned them. Their pale green habits, once symbols of mercy, became on campaign signals of hope and dread. Hope for the dying who watched their leaps through the melee, dread for the enemy who saw devils clothed in disease ride toward them. At Arsuf in 1191, accounts tell of a leper knight who, his left hand palsied by nodules, grasped the haft of his banner staff with unyielding will. He charged a force of Turcoman archers, breaking their ranks not with men's strength, but with the sheer force of faith. In chroniclers' pages, these warriors loom as paradoxes, bodies in decay, yet hearts burning with martial zeal. They fought on foot when armor proved too burdensome, their mail cut and padded to lighten the afflicted limbs. At Jaffa, when Saladin's host pressed the Crusader rear, leper footmen formed a shield wall, their pale cloaks gleaming under the sun. They held even as arrows thudded into wounded shoulders and spears splintered at clubs of bone and sinew. Through their defense, fresh reinforcements rallied, turning retreat into counterattack. Beyond the Holy Land, the legend of leprous champions spread like wildfire. High courts in Europe, moved by tales of valor, endowed Lazarite commanderies with land and coin. In England, Burton Lazars became not only a hospital but a training ground. Afflictions scarred the recruits, yet novices drilled with wooden swords beneath the watchful eyes of veteran brothers. When summoned to the continent, they carried both the tools of healing and of war, tending the wounded at dawn, patrolling ramparts by dusk. For many lepers, taking up arms was the ultimate penance, every swing of the sword a plea for mercy, every drop of their blood a prayer for purification. Theologians argued that their suffering mirrored Christ's wounds, leprous flesh a grotesque echo of the torn body on Calvary. In letters to Lazarite masters, bishops described these warriors as living sacrifices whose stones and arrows would atone more fully than psalms and fasts. When a leper knight fell, the masses attended his burial with solemn awe, trumpets silenced, banners lowered. His burial ground lay within consecrated earth, a final vindication of a soul cleansed by combat. Yet the path was perilous. In 1244 at La Forbie, the last great clash before the fall of Jerusalem, the Order of St. Lazarus rode in the vanguard of a broken army. Against the Khwarezmian tide, they pressed forward, their numbers thinned by disease and age. Chroniclers record that nearly every Lazarite banner fell that day. Green crosses, sinking into desert dust as brothers perished in penitent sacrifice. The toll was staggering. Hundreds of leprous knights and footmen, their bodies laid low, their souls exalted in martyrdom. Survivors carried their stories back to Europe, where the vision of lepers fighting for redemption inspired new waves of alms and crusading vows. Kings and popes sent relief to leprosaria, endowed new commanderies, and even commissioned frescoes of leprous warriors in cloistered chapels. Pilgrims who gazed upon stained glass windows saw the pale faces of Lazarite knights, their hands raised in blessing and defiance, and offered coins for the care of those who remained behind. In time, as leprosy waned in the West, the martial aspect of the Lazarites receded. Their arms were laid down in favor of spades and scalpels as they turned wholly to hospital work. Yet the memory endures. That desperate band of afflicted souls who, in an age of holy strife, found salvation through sacrifice. When you pass a medieval chapel dedicated to St. Lazarus, pause to imagine the muffled hoofbeats along dusty roads, the distant clang of steel, and the fragile forms that charged into battle, striving to wash sin in the crucible of war. In their courage and their wounds lie the unspoken promise that even the most broken body can rise to defend, to atone, and perhaps to be redeemed. The horrifying leper hunts. During the Black Death. In the early months of 1321, a whisper of fear began in the villages of southern France, spreading like wildfire through fields and markets. Tales circulated of barrels of foul-smelling bread discovered in the confines of leprosaria, proof, it was said, that those already shunned by society were plotting to poison the wells and fountains that sustained Christian townsfolk. No evidence ever emerged to substantiate such accusations, yet panic seized the populace, fueled by long-held prejudices and the promise of confiscated land and goods. Under mounting pressure from nobles hungry for the lepers' estates, King Philip V issued a royal decree in June mandating that anyone bearing the telltale signs of the Great Pox be rounded up, imprisoned, and interrogated without mercy. At dawn, municipal guards, often drunk on rumors and emboldened by civic sanction, marched into leper colonies on the outskirts of Toulouse, Cahors, and Avignon. Blind or crippled men and women, already accustomed to daily bell tolls that warned strangers to keep their distance, were dragged from tattered huts into makeshift dungeons beneath damp stone ramparts. Shackled by iron collars and wrists, they awaited trials conducted by local magistrates with little legal training and even less compassion. Torture chambers lurked in hidden corridors. The rack, which stretched sinews until bones threatened to snap, the iron boot, whose crushing force pulverized feet and ankles, and hot pincers that squeezed flesh between searing claws. Under excruciating pain, some accused began confessing to plots that existed only in the fevered imaginations of their torturers, naming co-conspirators, implicating neighboring villages, and weaving tales of alliance with distant Muslim rulers. Confessions secured, the accused were paraded through town centers in a grotesque display of power and reprisal. Bound to wooden carts or dragged by ropes, their gaunt frames and shuffling steps became stark symbols of communal vengeance. Public executions followed swiftly. Hastily constructed pyres dominated market squares and riverbanks, where crowds gathered at sunrise to witness the final verdict by fire. As kindling crackled beneath wooden stakes, town criers read aloud the confessions, each syllable reinforcing the illusion of guilt. Flames licked at dry robes, consuming frail bodies as onlookers hurled insults and stones. Some cried, "God judge them," while others feasted on roasted meats, convinced that they had helped purge the land of a hidden menace. Among those seized was Jeanne de Montaigu, a woman of indeterminate age who had once earned modest coin by mending vessels at the market's edge. Now she sat in a dank cell, her swollen hands stripped of feeling, staring at ceiling beams blackened by smoke from the rack. When awakened for questioning, she trembled as the magistrate demanded names of accomplices. When she whispered that she had no knowledge of any plot, the iron boot was applied. Her screams echoed through the corridors until she confessed to treason none could fathom and begged for death as release from the torment. As weeks passed, dissonant voices emerged among chroniclers and clerics. Brother Guillaume of Saint-Gilles, a Dominican friar, recorded in his ledger that no poisoned wells were ever found, and that confessions obtained under the lash are but the echoes of pain, not mirrors of truth. Municipal records from Limoges noted that of the 200 lepers arrested, only a handful remained alive by midsummer, and those were so broken by torture they could neither stand nor speak coherently. Some local judges began to petition the crown for clemency, questioning the validity of sentences handed down under panic rather than evidence. By August, the frenzy showed signs of collapse. The Council of Limoges quietly released surviving prisoners, though their homes had been seized and their belongings auctioned to fund the hunts. Royal envoys arrived to review the arrests, discovering charred pyres with no broken pottery or poisoned water, only ashes and bones scorched beyond identification. On the 27th of August, King Philip's edict was formally rescinded for the region, though no proclamation could restore what had been destroyed. In 1338, Pope Benedict XIV issued a papal bull acknowledging the innocence of those accused in Toulouse, Cahors, and Narbonne, ordering that restitution be made to families who remained. Yet such restitution proved mostly symbolic. Estates had been granted to new lords, and leprosaria lay abandoned or repurposed as military garrisons. For those who perished without trial or died under torture, no decree could recall their names from oblivion. The leper hunts of 1321 stand as a grim precursor to the terror that would engulf Europe with the arrival of the Black Death in 1347. They reveal how, in times of fear, societies can turn on their most vulnerable, sacrificing truth on the altar of expedience. As you guide viewers through this dark chapter, let them hear the clash of iron restraints, taste the acrid smoke of burning flesh, and understand the deadly power of rumor. Remind them that in the intersection of fear, greed, and ignorance, history offers both cautionary tales and lessons in humanity's potential for both cruelty and eventually contrition. The legacy of the leper king of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV. In the golden haze of a Levantine dawn, a lone figure emerged atop a sturdy destrier, his pale features framed by a circlet of simple steel. Born in 1161, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem inherited a crown and a curse. By age 7, the first signs of leprosy had invaded his body, causing numbness in his fingers and discoloration of his skin. In an age when the disease was equated with divine wrath, his diagnosis might have spelled the end of his prospects. Yet instead of retreating, the young prince steeled himself for a reign that would astonish both friend and foe. From his earliest days, Baldwin's instructors concealed his ordeal from the wider court. They taught him statecraft in the cool shadow of vaulted council chambers, where barons and bishops debated the fragile alliances that held the Crusader states together. He learned to speak with the gravity of a seasoned ruler, his clear blue gaze betraying none of the pain that sometimes racked his limbs. Beneath his garments he wore a simple leather glove over his left hand, his first shield against both the sting of the disease and the whispers of scandal. When Baldwin assumed the throne at age 13, Jerusalem teetered on the brink of collapse. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had already united Muslim forces and begun probing the kingdom's defenses. In 1177, Saladin's army advanced with overwhelming numbers. Many knights counseled caution, arguing that the thin desert air and lack of water favored the enemy. Baldwin, barely a teenager and visibly marked by disease, surprised them all by mounting a decisive offensive. Mounted on his favorite war-horse, the king led some 500 knights across the sun-baked plains toward the ominous camp of Saladin's vanguard. The morning sun glinted off Baldwin's polished helm and the steel gauntlet that concealed his ravaged fingers. At the mouth of the Wadi al-Shaykh, he raised his sword and cried a rallying call that echoed across the dunes. The knights thundered forward, their charge striking like a bolt of lightning against an unprepared foe. Though outnumbered 10-1, Baldwin's force shattered Saladin's lines, seizing the day and immortalizing the Battle of Montgisar. News of the victory spread like wildfire through Christendom. Chroniclers penned rhapsodies about the leper king who commanded from the front, insisting that the sight of his gauntleted hand mounted on a charging steed inspired more courage than any banner. In Europe, troubadours composed songs that told of a pale monarch who defied death to defend the holy city. Pilgrims arriving at Jerusalem's gates marveled at the tales, leaving gifts at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in thanksgiving for divine intervention. Yet Baldwin's triumph in battle did not temper the harsh realities of his condition. As the years passed, his limbs stiffened and his gait grew uncertain. By the early 1180s, he required crutches to walk and could no longer wield a sword. On the field, he commanded campaigns from a litter borne by trusted knights, issuing orders in a firm voice that brooked no dissent. In council, he governed with a blend of shrewd diplomacy and personal magnetism. He negotiated treaties with Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, managed the fractious barons of Galilee, and maintained the loyalty of the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, through personal appeals rather than force. Court life remained vibrant despite Baldwin's suffering. In the Tower of David, he hosted feasts to celebrate feasts of Pentecost and Nativity alike, the air thick with the aroma of spiced wine and roasted game. Troubadours recited verses extolling chivalry and sacrifice, often concluding with a flourish about the king whose flesh betrayed him even as his spirit shone. To mask his weakened hand, Baldwin commissioned a gauntlet of ornate design, inlaid with silver, and inscribed with the words, Dominus fortitudo mea, the Lord is my strength. The slender finger plates moved awkwardly, but the piece became a symbol of his unyielding resolve. In private, Baldwin endured long hours of prayer. In the chapels of Mount Zion and at the Holy Sepulchre, he knelt before gilded icons, reciting psalms for strength and absolution. Clerics noted that he often refused the last rites, believing that his continued suffering served as penance for his people's sins. On battlefield infirmary floors, he leaned over wounded knights, offering blessings and words of comfort. His compassion for the injured and destitute mirrored the charity of Christ, contrasting sharply with the marginalization he faced from many who viewed leprosy as a mark of sin. As the disease advanced, Baldwin faced his mortality with characteristic candor. In late 1183, he summoned a great council at Acre, where knights and nobles gathered in the shadow of the city's towering walls. With measured solemnity, he named his sister Sibylla's husband, Guy de Lusignan, as heir to the throne, an appointment that sowed the seeds of discord but underscored Baldwin's commitment to preserving the kingdom beyond his own life. He urged unity among the barons, knowing that civil strife would be more disastrous than any external threat. Within months, Baldwin's strength waned further. He could no longer rise from his bed except to attend brief ceremonies. Yet, even in his final days, he displayed regal dignity. As the sun set over Jerusalem in March of 1185, he summoned his most trusted advisers and delivered his last counsel: protect the city, honor the church, and stand firm against Saladin's ambitions. His voice, though faint, carried a weight that hushed the assembly. When he breathed his last, the city fell silent. The funeral procession wound through streets crowded with grieving citizens and tearful nobles alike. His coffin, covered with violet cloth and bearing his crown and gauntlet, was carried into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where bells tolled mournful dirges. Many wept openly, lamenting the loss of a king who had turned his curse into a source of strength and inspiration. Baldwin IV's legacy endured far beyond his brief reign. His stand at Montgessart delayed Saladin's further incursions, granting the Crusader states precious years of relative peace. His personal example altered medieval conceptions of kingship, demonstrating that true sovereignty could rest not on physical perfection, but on moral conviction and courage. Chroniclers in Latin and Arabic alike praised his character, ensuring that his story would echo across cultures. Today, historians study Baldwin's reign not only for its military and political significance, but for its testament to resilience in the face of adversity. His life invites modern audiences to reflect on the human capacity to transcend suffering and to lead with compassion and honor, even when the body falters. The leper king of Jerusalem stands as an eternal reminder that the power of the human spirit can outshine any infirmity, and that in the crucible of trial, greatness may yet be forged. The symbolism of lepers in medieval art. Imagine stepping into a dimly lit chapel in a medieval town where candlelight dances across frescoed walls. There, among scenes of saints and sinners, you encounter the figure of the leper. Cloaked in ragged garments, his skin marred by lesions, he stands not as a mere victim of disease, but as a living emblem. Artists of the Middle Ages did not portray lepers simply as pitiable outcasts. They invested them with symbolic weight, using their afflicted bodies to convey spiritual truths and moral warnings. In book illuminations and stained glass, lepers often appear at the margins of sacred narratives. In one 13th century psalter, a leprous beggar kneels at the gate of a grand city, his outstretched hand echoing the plea of the poor before the throne of God. His body is gaunt, his face a pale mask of suffering. Yet his presence is more than historical detail. It speaks to the believer of the consequences of sin and the need for divine mercy. The malformed flesh becomes a visual sermon, human corruption on full display, reminding viewers that unchecked vice rots the soul as visibly as leprosy eats the skin. Courtly tapestries sometimes include lepers in apocalyptic scenes. In one Flemish tapestry of the Last Judgment, angels separate the saved from the damned atop a rising column of light. Below, demons drag the sinner into the mouth of Leviathan, while a community of lepers huddles in the background, their sores rendered with grotesque precision. Here, leprosy stands in for the moral decay that leads souls astray. The artist deliberately juxtaposes the afflicted body with the eternal torments awaiting those who turn from God, casting leprosy as divine punishment incarnate. Meanwhile, in devotional diptychs, Christ's healing miracles provide a counterpoint. A 13-panel ivory altarpiece from Germany portrays Christ touching a leper and transforming his skin from scarlet blotches to smooth, pale flesh. The sequence dramatizes the power of faith and baptism. The baptized believer, once dead in sin, rises to new life. The before and after images mirror the allegory of death and resurrection. The leper's decaying body becomes a metaphor for the soul's bondage to sin and its miraculous healing, an emblem of redemption. The symbolism extends beyond Christian contexts. In medieval Muslim manuscripts, the afflicted body signifies hubris. In a 12th century Arabic medical text, an illustration of King Uzziah's leprosy accompanies commentary on the dangers of pride. The king, punished by God for presuming to burn incense in the temple, is marked by blemishes as a sign of divine judgment. The portrayal of Uzziah's flesh echoes the moral lesson. Those who exalt themselves fall into disgrace, their bodies a testament to God's sovereignty. Artists sometimes exploited the tension between pity and repulsion. In the margins of legal codices, marginalia depict grotesque lepers dancing alongside demons, their sores exaggerated into bulging tumors. These fantastic images link leprosy to social disorder and chaos. The leper's body, stripped of recognizable humanity, warns readers that social harmony depends on moral purity. Just as a leper must be cast out to protect the community, so must sinful behavior be purged to preserve social order. Yet not all representations are condemnatory. In Parisian coronation liturgies, chroniclers record the gifting of alms to lepers as part of the king's oath. Illuminations from these manuscripts show lepers receiving bread from the monarch's hand, their wounds discreetly veiled. The scene conveys the ideal of Christian charity. Even those deemed dead to the world deserve compassion. Underneath the veil of disease lies the imago Dei, the divine image that persists in every human, however afflictive the flesh. In cathedrals, sculpted portals sometimes frame the Savior's image with pairs of lepers at his feet. A 14th century portal in Chartres Cathedral shows two figures kneeling beside Christ the healer. Their faces are turned upward, eyes blurred from disease, yet fixed in hope. The sculptor carved their lesions with such realism that the viewer feels the sting of contagion and the promise of relief. Here, lepers symbolize both the human condition, marked by suffering, and the promise of salvation that transcends corruption. Over time, the symbolism of leprosy evolved. By the Renaissance, humanist thinkers critiqued medieval tropes as overly moralistic. Portraits replaced allegory, and real-life patients became subjects of medical interest rather than heavenly metaphors. Yet the medieval legacy endures. In every tinted window and parchment margin where a leper's hollow gaze meets ours, we glimpse ancient fears and hopes. We see how art wielded the image of living death to teach lessons about sin, punishment, and the boundless power of mercy. Through the scarred flesh of the leper, medieval artists invited viewers to confront their own mortality, and to discover that even in the most desolate places, the spark of divine compassion still shines. Forced oaths of celibacy for lepers. In the cold dawn air, a small crowd gathers outside the earthen walls of the leprosarium. A priest stands before a makeshift altar of rough-hewn oak, his face grave beneath the weight of his vestments. Before him kneels a pale figure draped in tattered robes, eyes downcast. The moment has come, the taking of a solemn oath, one that will seal the outcast's fate, not only to isolation, but to lifelong celibacy and renunciation of all intimate human contact. This forced vow, imposed on those branded by leprosy, reveals the medieval world's tangled fears of contagion, sin, and the fragile boundary between body and soul. Leprosy, known as the White Plague, arrived in Western Europe around the 6th century, and by the High Middle Ages had spread to every corner of Christendom. Fear of its disfigurements and mysterious transmission led to harsh legal codes. In England, statutes of the 12th century declared lepers legal nonentities. Once diagnosed, they lost titles, lands, and the right to marry. In France, the Leprosy Ordinance of 1269 ordered lepers to swear renunciation of conjugal relations and to relinquish all bonds of kinship. Spanish councils in the 14th century prescribed identical oaths before exile to lazar houses perched beyond city walls. The pattern was clear. To control the disease, society would control the body and heart. The ritual varied by region, but its essentials were universal. At sunrise on a market day, town criers would summon the afflicted to gather in front of church. Stripped of jewelry, their hands were bound with hempen cords. A clerk read aloud the charges. "You shall touch no man or woman, wed no spouse, engender no child, henceforth renouncing all earthly affections." The priest raised a weathered gospel, opened to the words of St. Paul on chastity, and set it upon the kneeler. One by one, each leper placed trembling fingers upon the sacred text and spoke the scripted words. "I swear to renounce marriage, to forsake all embraces, to break no vow of celibacy." In some regions, a ring symbolizing marriage was struck off the leper's finger and cast into a flame, its metal blistering before the witnesses. In others, the new outcasts signed their names in a register, each signature a seal upon their flesh. Anyone found in violation of the oath would be subject to fines, public whipping, or even death by drowning. Such was the terror of spilled contagion. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris recorded cases in 13th century England where lepers caught in an illicit embrace were branded on the cheek or exiled beyond the hospital gates entirely, never to return. Yet beneath the harsh exterior lay a complex tapestry of religion, charity, and control. While the Church demanded celibacy to protect the community, priests and monastic orders also viewed the vow as a path to spiritual purity. To shun earthly desires was to emulate Christ's own sacrifice. Some leper priests and monks volunteered to take identical vows in solidarity, sharing in the community's suffering. In Germany, the Order of St. Lazarus maintained stringent vows of chastity for its knightly brethren, linking care for the diseased with martial piety. The theological argument went that by removing all carnal distractions, the leper's soul might draw closer to God. Still, the human cost was immense. Lepers, stripped of family ties and barred from marriage, found themselves in a perpetual state of social death. Young men and women, once betrothed, watched their weddings dissolve at the hospital gates. Children born to leprous parents were taken from their mothers by ecclesiastical decree, baptized and raised in orphanages to prevent hereditary transmission, a measure predicated on now discredited beliefs, yet enforced with bureaucratic zeal. The oath of celibacy thus became not only a medical precaution, but a tool of social engineering, severing bloodlines and reshaping communities. Medical treatises of the era, from Bernard de Gordon's Practica Chirurgiae to Guy de Chauliac's Inventarium Sanitatis, mention these oaths only in passing, focusing instead on herbal remedies and pustule cauterization. Yet legal codices and municipal records teem with references to the ritual. In 1351, the city charter of Montpellier ordered that all lepers undergo the oath before receiving food stipends. Failure meant no more bread or gruel. A century later, Toulouse's city council mandated that women who broke the vow face a public shaming ritual. They would parade through the marketplace wearing a veil of coarse cloth accompanied by a pair of consecrated candles, their crime proclaimed by the town crier. The Renaissance and early modern period brought new treatments, chalmugra oil, then sulfon drugs, and attitudes began to shift. As leprosy's prevalence waned, the rationale for forced celibacy weakened. Enlightenment thinkers like John Howard decried the oath as inhumane, arguing that it punished victims more than it protected society. By the late 19th century, most European nations had abolished the oath requirement, replacing it with voluntary isolation and offering medical care without moral judgment. Norway's St. Jurgen's Hospital, which remained open until 1946, is one of the few institutions whose archives record the final oaths taken in the early 1800s, a poignant testament to the long half-life of medieval stigma. Yet echoes of the practice linger. In colonial leprosaria in Hawaii and India, administrators often invoked similar celibacy vows well into the 20th century, long after sulfone cures rendered leprosy a treatable condition. The psychological scars ran deep. Generations of leprosy survivors recounted in interviews how the enforced vows severed not only their flesh from others, but their very sense of belonging. Only in recent decades have leprosy-affected individuals organized to reclaim their rights, to marry, to reunite with families, to speak openly of their desires and sufferings without fear of reprisal. Today, when we look back on those narrow oaths uttered beneath church spires, we see a world wrestling with the limits of compassion and control. The forced vow of celibacy for lepers was at once an act of mercy and an assertion of power, a promise extracted under duress, binding body and soul in chains forged by fear. As modern medicine triumphs and social attitudes transform, the memory of that vow remains a cautionary tale. Even noble intentions, when entwined with ignorance and prejudice, can lead to the imposition of cruel disciplines. The true measure of a society's care is not found in its methods of containment, but in its capacity to honor the dignity and desires of every human being, regardless of the frailty of their mortal frame. Leper colonies on islands, isolated until death. They set sail before dawn, the prows of small boats cleaving the Aegean's glassy surface as families watched from the shore, unsure whether they mourned departure or grudged the exile. Behind them lay villages where the word leprosy had become a curse whispered in doorways. Ahead lay Spinalonga, an island wrapped in battlements and barbed law, where those branded by Hansen's disease were left to forge a life in isolation until death claimed them. Their boats nudged against stone piers. Armed guards herded them past ramparts into barracks once meant for Venetian soldiers. No one wept openly. Tears could be mistaken for weakness, or worse, for the stain of contagion. Conditions on Spinalonga were stark. Sun-baked walls offered scant shade. Cisterns, fed by rare rainfall, meant water rationed to a cup at dawn and dusk. The first colony in 1903 was rudimentary. Wooden huts, canvas tents, and a handful of makeshift latrines perched perilously near the cliff's edge. When the wind howled, the shelters rattled like funeral drums. Yet the newcomers carried more than nodules and nerve pain. They carried memories of families, of festivals, of marketplaces alive with laughter. On the island, laughter sounded forbidden. Instead, occasional music drifted from a tattered accordion, a fragile assertion of humanity against despair. Rules were draconian. No one could swim to the mainland. Escape meant execution. Mail arrived weekly in a sealed crate, thrust through a slot in the governor's office. Medicine, primarily chalmugra oil, was dispensed sparingly, its sting a small penance for relief. Nurses, often lepers themselves in remission, administered care at risk of ostracism. Children born to those afflicted were sometimes permitted to stay if free of symptoms, but most were torn from their mothers, raised in orphanages where the word mother became a ghost. Life on Spinalonga settled into a grim routine. At sunrise, the healthy lepers, those at early stages, marshaled the infirm to a communal washhouse where they scrubbed sores with lime and seawater. By midday, villagers gathered near the church ruin atop the hill, not for prayer, but for the only shade the fallen arches provided. Here they traded scraps of news: a death on Crete, a donation from a wealthy benefactor in Athens, a priest's visit scheduled for Feast of the Transfiguration. Children chased goats that scavenged among the ruins, their bleeding offspring of hope in a world otherwise sealed off. At dusk, when the last ferry retreated toward Crete carrying returning guards and fresh provisions, the island began to breathe its own prayers. Lamps were lit in windows carved into the rock, silhouettes of haggard women bent over sewing frames, hand-stitching linen for imperial hospitals, unaware of their maker's fate. Men sat in circles flitting cards, the snap of each deal punctuating the humid air. Some smoked thin cheroots, their brittle leaves a bitter luxury. A doctor's lamp cast long shadows as he recorded vital signs: pulse, temperature, ulcer progression, data destined for distant journals, but scarcely comforting to those whose flesh was failing. Far to the west, across oceans and empires, lay Molokai. In 1866, the Hawaiian kingdom shipped its first leprous subjects to Kalaupapa Peninsula, a narrow spit carved from volcanic cliffs. Here, too, families were torn apart. A mother might sit on a cliff's edge, her swollen hands cradling a child for one last embrace before soldiers marched the afflicted down the hillside path, a descent into a world without return. The peninsula's isolation rivaled Spinalonga's. Miles of shark-infested water hemmed the colony in, as if nature itself conspired to seal their exile. On Molokai, Father Damien arrived in 1873, drawn not by duty, but by compassion. He built churches, schools, and infirmaries with his own hands, plastering walls with coral lime mixed from the shore. Under his care, the colony sprouted gardens, bananas, sweet potatoes, taro, plants that pushed through volcanic ash to sustain a ragtag community. He ate alongside the lepers, slept in the same scattered huts, and baptized their children. Yet his devotion proved mortal. By 1889, he too bore the disease and died a brother to those he served. Despite Father Damien's legacy, life on Molokai remained brutal. Terrain was rugged. Rainwater collected in barrels scarce as hope. Imported medicine arrived in waves too small to quell the advance of nodules. Lepers carved terraces into cliffs, planting coconuts whose roots wedged cracks in basalt. Music enlivened Sabbath services. Steel guitars strummed hymns that mingled grief and grace. Marriages took place beneath palms, vows exchanged on a land deemed accursed. Children with healthy skin occasionally slipped through, raised by caregivers who loved them as their own. As dawn broke over the Pacific in 1894, Queen Liliuokalani visited Kalaupapa, her skirts rustling against coral sand. She knelt among the afflicted, pressing a lei of gardenias into the hands of an elderly man whose eyes glimmered with recognition not of royalty, but of simple human worth. Yet her presence did little to change isolation. Quarantine laws tightened, and the peninsula remained a place of exile until medical breakthroughs in the 20th century rendered fear obsolete and leprosy curable. On both islands, death was ever present. Graves were dug into steep slopes marked with chipped crosses and weather-worn headstones. Funerals were small, often held at midnight to avoid the glare of mainland eyes. A solitary priest might chant requiem under the stars as winds wept through trees shedding yellow leaves. When coffins slid silently into earth, the living whispered promises to remember, promising that stories of suffering would outlive stone and salt. By mid-century, antibiotics transformed leprosy from life sentence to treatable infection. Spinalonga closed in 1957. Molokai's last patients finally left in 1969. The islands remained, but leper colonies vanished. Today, Spinalonga is a sunlit ruin visited by tourists who marvel at crumbling walls without grasping the anguish once contained within. On Molokai, the National Park Service preserves Hansen's disease settlements, offering guided tours that tiptoe between reverence and spectacle. Yet beneath the white stones and placid waters, the ghosts endure. In Spinalonga's empty barracks, one can almost hear the rasp of linen wounds cleaning at dawn. On Molokai's cliffs, the wind still carries a distant hymn, a remnant of Father Damien's voice proclaiming God's love. Their stories remind us that exile, even in paradise, is a prison. They show that compassion sometimes arrives too late, that walls can degrade flesh but not faith, and that redemption, whether sought in service or penance, can bloom amid the most barren rock. If you step quietly among these ruins, let your silence honor the thousands who lived and died in isolation until merciful medicine granted freedom. Let your remembrance become their legacy, that even the most forsaken souls stand worthy of dignity, that compassion is the truest cure, and that no island, however fortified by fear, can ever fully contain the human spirit.